The nightmare began with small things that eventually turned into a campaign of pure psychological warfare. Miller, the tenant in apartment 4B, spent 8 long months transforming the shared hallway into a gauntlet of spite. He was caught on camera multiple times intentionally pouring industrial-grade bleach onto the neighbor's doorstep at 3:00 a.m., making the air in the corridor nearly unbreathable. He followed this by mounting a high-frequency siren against the shared wall. It was triggered by a sensitive motion sensor so that every time the neighbor moved in their own living room or even adjusted a chair, a piercing metallic shriek ripped through the apartment. Miller's spite hoard was the centerpiece of his campaign. He spent weeks dragging old wooden pallets, gasoline-soaked rags, and hundreds of discarded lithium-ion batteries into 4B, stacking them floor to ceiling against the vents and the shared walls. When confronted by the building manager, Miller's only response was to scream through the door that the building was his kingdom and everyone else was just a guest. He was tired of hosting. By the second month of this documented war, the psychological toll on the entire floor was visible. Miller began a ritual of hallway intimidation, where he would sit in a lawn chair just outside his door for hours, holding a rusted baseball bat, and staring silently at anyone who tried to pass by to reach the elevator. He began a ritual of garbage bombing, waiting until he heard the neighbor leave for work and then immediately smearing rotten fish, kitchen scraps, and used coffee grounds across their door handle and peephole. This was the deep, exhausting reality of living next to someone who had made misery their primary hobby. There was a stack of over 50 police reports and HOA fines that Miller simply used as wallpaper for his front door, mocking the legal system and his neighbors in a series of recorded rants where he claimed he was untouchable and that a great judgment was coming for the whole floor. As the months dragged on, the situation reached a critical mass of danger. Miller's power was eventually cut off for non-payment and repeated safety violations. Instead of leaving or seeking help, he doubled down on the chaos to prove he couldn't be moved. He began using a portable propane camping stove and dozens of open-flame candles placed on top of unstable, waist-high stacks of dry newspapers right against the neighbor's wall. The neighbor used a thermal camera to document the heat signature through the drywall, showing the temperatures reaching 120 degrees on their side of the wall. The neighbor pleaded for Miller to stop before the whole floor was lost, but Miller's only reply was a chilling note slid under the door that read, "This is the penance for trying to kick me out." During the final week leading up to the disaster, building management attempted a forced entry for a mandatory safety inspection. Miller had reinforced his door from the inside with steel bars and heavy timber. He was heard splashing a liquid against the other side of the wood, screaming that he had booby-trapped the unit with accelerants and that the first person to break the plane of the door would set it all off. The police were forced to back down to avoid a mass casualty confrontation, a move that only emboldened his psychosis. That night, he began a relentless drum circle using empty metal chemical drums, hammering on them with a lead pipe until sunrise to ensure no one in the building could sleep. Families were huddled in the lobby, too afraid to stay in their beds but with nowhere else to go, while Miller's shadow could be seen dancing past his window in the glow of his illegal lanterns. The disaster finally struck on a dry, windy Friday evening, when the wind was whipping between the buildings. Miller decided to light a charcoal hibachi grill in the center of his living room, surrounded by his mountain of dry timber and oily rags, claiming he was barbecuing his final meal. Thick, yellow smoke began to pour through the electrical outlets and the light fixtures of the neighboring units. The neighbor frantically banged on every door in the hallway to evacuate the floor, while Miller could be heard inside 4B, laughing hysterically and shouting that he was finally cleaning house. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the building as one of the hidden propane canisters ignited from the heat. The door to 4B was blown completely off its hinges and across the hallway, releasing a wall of black chemical smoke and a rolling wave of orange flame that instantly ignited the carpet. The next several minutes were a frantic, handheld struggle for survival as the neighbor tried to lead others to safety. They had to navigate a hallway that Miller had intentionally cluttered with tripwire junk, broken glass, and burning debris to slow down any escape. The roar of the fire was deafening, joined by the rhythmic shrieking of building-wide alarms and the sickening sound of the structural beams in 4B beginning to snap and groan under the extreme heat. Because Miller had blocked the emergency fire escape with old refrigerators and rusted scrap metal, the residents were nearly trapped on the 4th floor. From the street, the flashover was visible to onlookers as the entire unit of 4B turned into a 1,500-degree furnace in under 3 minutes, blowing out the exterior windows with enough force to send glass shards 50 feet into the air. As the fire hit Miller's hoard of lithium batteries, a series of blinding green and blue sparks shot out of the windows like a twisted firework display, accompanied by the smell of toxic metal. The heat was so intense that it began to melt the vinyl siding of the building across the alley and cracked the windshields of cars parked on the street below. Everything the neighbor owned, photos, clothes, and a lifetime of memories, was being consumed by the pure spite of the man in 4B. Neighbors who had spent months being harassed now watched their lives go up in smoke because one man refused to be told no. The fire moved with a hungry, sentient speed, leaping from Miller's hoard to the ceiling joists, turning the hallway into a chimney of fire. The fire department arrived to find the nearest hydrants obstructed by the junk cars Miller had parked illegally on the sidewalk. This delay allowed the fire to fully claim the roof of the wing. The windows of 4B shattered and melted into distorted puddles of glass on the pavement. Miller was eventually dragged out by a rescue crew through a smashed window after they cut through his steel reinforcements. He was blackened by soot, his clothes were singed, and he was barely conscious, having lost every single item he had hoarded to torment the neighborhood. He stood on the sidewalk in handcuffs once he regained his breath, watching as the unit was gutted to the studs. He even tried to blame the neighbor for the fire as he was being loaded into the ambulance, screaming that they had pushed him to it, showing that his spite remained intact even after his kingdom was destroyed. The aftermath involved weeks of grueling insurance battles and structural engineers declaring the entire wing of the building a total loss and uninhabitable. The neighbors were forced into temporary housing, their lives disrupted for months while investigations continued. Miller was eventually brought back to the site in an orange jumpsuit and heavy shackles to identify any remaining chemical hazards for the arson investigators. The community gathered to watch this moment in a silent wall of people who had been pushed past their limit. There was a look of total, hollow defeat on Miller's face as he realized the building was being slated for demolition. His fortress was being turned into a vacant lot, and his penance was a lifetime of debt, millions in civil liabilities, and a long prison sentence. The morning light revealed a blackened, dripping skeleton of a building that used to be a home. Arson investigators spent days sifted through the rubble, eventually pulling out the melted remains of the hibachi grill and the charred metal canisters that turned a petty neighbor feud into a literal inferno. Miller was led away to a high-security facility, facing 20 years for aggravated arson, reckless endangerment, and multiple counts of assault. A massive red condemned sign was nailed to the charred remains of the entrance. Miller wanted the neighbor to suffer and pay for his disrespect, but in the end, his own house burning down was the only penance that could finally bring peace to the street. The final view of the property shows a slow, steady rise from the cracked, soot-covered pavement up to the empty, charred hole in the skyline where apartment 4B used to be, now just a memory of smoke and spite.